The hailstorm came out of nowhere, the way all truly life-changing things do, and when Jasper Fletcher heard the crack of a wagon axle splitting clean above the roar of ice pelting his barn roof, he did not know that the sound was the beginning of absolutely everything. The year was 1873, and the town of Caldwell Creek sat at the edge of the Kansas plains like a period at the end of a long, dusty sentence. It was not a beautiful town by anyone's measure. It had a general store run by a man named Horace Prout, who charged too much for flour and too little for conversation, a saloon called the Copper Spur that smelled of sawdust and regret, a livery stable, a church that got more use as a meeting hall than a house of God, and roughly 4 dozen souls who had decided, for one reason or another, that this particular stretch of sun-baked earth was worth staying on. Jasper Fletcher had decided it back in 1868, when he was 22 years old, and had ridden in from Missouri with $40, a good horse, and a pair of hands that had spent their whole young life learning how to fix things. He had built his smithy on the far east end of the main road, and over 5 years he had made himself useful to every rancher, farmer, and traveler within 30 miles. He shoed horses. He mended wagon wheels. He forged hinges and hooks and barrel rings. He was, by all accounts, a quiet and steady man, brown-haired and broad-shouldered, with green eyes that people sometimes described as the color of creek water in late summer, and a manner so unhurried that some of the older townspeople had taken to calling him Slow River, though never to his face. He lived alone in the 2-room house attached to the back of the smithy. He had a cat named Dutch who caught mice and showed no affection whatsoever. He had a good cast-iron skillet and a decent rifle and a bookshelf with 7 books on it that he had read so many times the spines had gone soft. He was not, in any obvious way, a lonely man. But there is a particular kind of solitude that is different from loneliness, a quietness that becomes so habitual that a man stops noticing the sound of his own life. And Jasper Fletcher had settled into that quietness so completely that on the morning of September the 4th, 1873, he genuinely could not have told you what it was that was missing. Then the hailstorm hit. It came in the early afternoon, which was unusual, rolling off the plains with a darkness that turned the sky the color of a bad bruise. Jasper was inside the smithy, working on a set of wagon rims for Ed Crowley's hay wagon, when the first stones began to rattle against the tin roof like rifle fire. He set down his hammer and went to stand in the doorway, watching the ice come down in sheets, pea-sized at first and then growing to the size of marbles, bouncing off the hard-packed road in little white explosions. He had seen hailstorms before. The Kansas plains were not shy about weather. He watched it with the calm appreciation of a man who has learned that there is no point arguing with the sky. That was when he heard the crack. It was a sound he knew well, a deep, wood-splitting report that cut even through the percussion of the hail, followed almost immediately by the terrified screaming of a horse. Jasper was already moving before the screaming had stopped, grabbing his hat and coat off the hook beside the door and running out into the storm with his head down, and the ice hammering his shoulders and the back of his neck. He saw the wagon first. It had come off the main road about 40 yards north of his smithy, lurching sideways into the shallow ditch that ran along the road's edge, and it was tilted at a severe angle. The left rear wheel collapsed entirely. The axle sunk into the mud. It was a good wagon. He could see that even from a distance. A proper Studebaker with a canvas cover that was now bowing and snapping violently in the wind. The horse in the traces, a roan mare, was in a state of high panic, thrashing and pulling and threatening to drag what remained of the wagon right out of the ditch and into worse trouble. Jasper reached the horse first. He got to her head and took hold of the bridle with both hands, speaking low and close to her ear, letting her feel the steadiness in him, the same way he had been calming frightened animals since he was a boy back in Missouri. It took a solid 2 minutes, with the hail coming down the whole time and the ice stinging his face and hands. But the mare eventually stopped thrashing and stood trembling, her sides heaving, her great dark eye rolling back at him with something that was at least closer to trust than panic. That was when the canvas flap at the back of the wagon whipped open. She came out of that wagon the way a woman with a great deal of purpose comes out of any confined space, which is to say all at once and with complete intent. She was wearing a dark green riding skirt and a white shirtwaist that was already soaked through with the rain that had started mixing with the hail, and she had brown hair that had come partially loose from its pins and was plastered to her neck and jaw. She was not young in the fragile sense of the word. She looked to be somewhere in her mid-20s, and she had the kind of face that was not strictly beautiful by any conventional frontier measure, but was instead arresting, all strong jaw and dark eyes, and a mouth set in a line of absolute, furious determination. She jumped down from the wagon bed into the mud of the ditch without hesitation, and immediately went to the collapsed rear wheel, crouching down beside it in the driving hail to assess the damage with her bare hands. Jasper watched her do this from where he stood at the mare's head. He watched her probe the broken axle with her fingers and look at the angle of the wheel and press her lips together in what was clearly a precise calculation of the disaster. Then she looked up at him. "How far to the nearest smithy?" she called, raising her voice above the storm. He blinked hailstones off his eyelashes. "You are standing 40 yards from it," he said. She looked at him for a moment, then looked past him down the road, and he could see her make the same rapid assessment of the smithy that she had made of the broken axle. "Can you fix it?" she said. "Yes," he said, "but not in a hailstorm." She stood up from the mud. She was taller than he had initially thought, and there was something in the way she stood, straight-backed and square-shouldered despite being soaked to the skin in a ditch in a hailstorm, that made Jasper Fletcher feel, for the first time in a very long time, that something interesting was happening. "Right," she said. "What do we do first?" He told her to get back in the wagon and keep the canvas down while he got the mare calmed enough to stand without pulling on the damaged rigging. She did not argue, which surprised him, and she did not go back into the wagon either, which did not surprise him at all. Instead, she went to the mare's other side and began speaking to the horse in a low, steady voice, running her hand down the animal's wet neck, mirroring what Jasper was doing on the opposite side without being told. He noticed that the mare responded to her. That told him something. It took them 20 minutes to get the horse unhitched and walk to his barn through the hammering hail. The woman held the mare's bridle and led her without flinching, while Jasper guided the animal from the side. And when they got into the barn, and the noise of the storm dropped to a muffled roar against the roof, the woman let out one long, controlled breath that was the closest thing to visible relief he had seen from her. She turned to him in the dim, yellow light of the barn lantern. The hail had gone to rain. He could hear the shift in the sound above them, and water ran from her hair and off the tip of her nose and dripped from her chin. "Augusta Keating," she said, and put out her hand. He shook it. Her grip was firm, her hand cold as river ice. "Jasper Fletcher," he said. "Mr. Fletcher," she said. "I need to be in Abilene by Thursday. That is 4 days from now. Tell me what I'm looking at." He thought about the axle. "The axle is split clean through. I can forge a new one, but it will take me the better part of 2 days. You will also need a new wheel, and I have a spare that will fit a Studebaker of that size, but I will need to check the traces and the rigging too, because if your horse was fighting that hard in the panic, something may have been stressed." She absorbed this the way a businesswoman absorbs a balance sheet, quickly and without visible alarm. "And you can have it ready by Wednesday morning, if nothing unexpected comes up." "What would you charge?" he told her. She named a lower figure. He considered it because it was actually fair and agreed. "Good," she said. "Is there somewhere I can stay? A hotel?" He hesitated. Caldwell Creek did not technically have a hotel. It had a boarding house run by a widow named Marvella Shook that had 2 rooms for travelers, and Marvella's cooking was a matter of some local controversy, but it was dry and the beds were clean. He told her as much. Augusta Keating looked at him for a moment with those dark eyes of hers, and he had the distinct feeling she was assessing him the same way she had assessed the axle and the smithy, quickly, thoroughly, and without sentiment. "I will need to get my things from the wagon," she said. "I will take you," he said. "The rain is letting up." He walked her back out to the wagon, and that was when he understood more about her situation. The wagon was loaded with purpose. There were 3 trunks in the back, good quality but practical, a crate of books, a rolled map case, a leather satchel that appeared to contain documents, and a small wooden box with a brass latch that she moved immediately to her person when they climbed into the wagon bed, holding it with a quiet possessiveness that told him it mattered. She was not a woman moving lightly through the world. She was a woman carrying something specific toward a specific destination, and the storm had briefly interrupted her. He helped her carry the trunks. She would not let him take the wooden box or the leather satchel, and he did not offer twice. Marvella Shook was, as expected, both suspicious and welcoming at the same time, the particular combination of frontier hospitality and frontier wariness that Jasper had come to understand as deeply Kansan. She took Augusta's money for the room without comment and showed her upstairs, and the last Jasper saw of Augusta Keating that first evening was her standing in the doorway of the boarding house, her wet skirt steaming slightly in the warmth coming from inside, looking back at him with an expression he could not entirely read. "Wednesday morning, Mr. Fletcher," she said. "Wednesday morning, Miss Keating," he said. He walked back to his smithy in the cooling, post-storm dusk, and Dutch the cat met him at the door with absolute indifference, and Jasper stood in his smithy for a long moment looking at the broken axle he had carried in from the ditch, and thinking about a pair of dark eyes and a firm handshake, and the way she had walked into that mud and knelt beside the broken wheel without any of the helplessness that the situation might have warranted. He started the forge. The next morning arrived clear and sharp, the way Kansas mornings do after a big storm, the sky washed to a blue so deep it almost hurt to look at, every surface glittering with the water that was already beginning to steam off the hard ground in the climbing heat. Jasper was at work before 7, heating and shaping the steel for the new axle, the ring of his hammer carrying out over the empty morning road with a clean authority that he had always found satisfying in a way he could not fully articulate. He liked making broken things whole. He had always liked that. He did not expect to see Augusta Keating before 8 at the earliest, and so he was genuinely surprised when, at 7:30, she appeared in the open doorway of the smithy with 2 cups of coffee, one in each hand and the leather satchel over her shoulder. "Marvella's coffee is better than her biscuits," she said, holding one of the cups out to him. He set his hammer down and took it. The coffee was, in fact, very good. He told her so. She leaned against the doorframe and looked around the smithy with the same attentive, cataloging expression she seemed to apply to everything, taking in the ordered rows of tools, the spare wagon wheels hanging on the far wall, the drawings he had tacked above his workbench of various fittings and designs he had made over the years. "You made those?" she asked, nodding toward the drawings. "When I have a problem I have not solved before, I draw it out first," he said. "Helps me see it." "I do the same thing," she said, and there was a note of genuine surprise in her voice, as if the information pleased her unexpectedly. She sat on the low stool he kept near the door for customers who needed to wait, and she opened the leather satchel on her knee and took out a sheaf of papers, and she worked there in the morning light while he worked at the forge, and they talked. Not constantly, and not with the performing effort of 2 strangers trying to impress each other, but the way people talk when they are both occupied with something else, and the talking is simply the natural accompaniment to the occupation. He learned that she was 26 years old, that she had been born in St. Louis and had worked there for 4 years as a bookkeeper for a trading company owned by a man named Aldous Reeves, who had been, by her brief and carefully worded account, both exacting and fair. That Aldous Reeves had died 8 months ago of a heart failure, and that his estate had been left in some disorder, and that Augusta had spent the better part of those 8 months disentangling the various accounts and settling the various debts, and that she was now traveling to Abilene because a cattle broker named Gerald Sims owed the estate a considerable sum and had been avoiding correspondence for months, and Augusta Keating had decided that correspondence was no longer the appropriate tool. "You are going to confront him yourself," Jasper said. "I am going to retrieve what is owed," she said, without looking up from her papers. He turned this over. "Does anyone know you are coming?" "Mr. Sims does not," she said. "His lawyer does. I wrote the lawyer. He wrote back suggesting that I send a male representative." There was a pause. "I wrote back," she said, "and told him I was the representative." Jasper picked up his hammer and went back to the axle. After a moment he said, "How much does Sims owe?" $3,200, she said. He stopped hammering. $3,000 was enough to buy a good farm or start a reasonable business or keep a family fed for several years. He started hammering again. "Is it going to be dangerous?" he asked. "I imagine it will be unpleasant," she said calmly. "Dangerous is possible but not my primary concern. The primary concern is documentation." She held up one of the papers. "I have every record, every transaction, every promissory note. Mr. Sims signed them himself." He looked at her across the smithy. The morning light was coming through the doorway at an angle that caught the side of her face, and she was looking at her papers with an expression of such complete and focused competence that something moved in Jasper's chest that he did not immediately have a name for. "You are not what I expected," he said. She looked up then. "What did you expect?" He considered telling her something diplomatic. Instead he said, "I am not sure." "But you came out of that wagon in the middle of a hailstorm and went straight to the axle. I have had grown men stand in the road and wait for someone else to handle the problem." She looked at him steadily. "I have not found that standing in the road helps much," she said. He found himself smiling. It had been a while since he had smiled in conversation with someone. He was not sure when it had stopped happening regularly, but it had, the way a lot of things stop happening when a man lives too close to his own routine. She left around mid-morning to do some business at the general store and to send a telegraph from the Caldwell Creek post office, and Jasper worked through the hottest part of the day in focused solitude, but the smithy felt different than it had the day before. Not noisier, not different in any way he could point to specifically, just less like the inside of a bell jar and more like a room where someone had recently been. She came back at 3 in the afternoon with 2 pieces of apple pie wrapped in cloth from the lunch counter at the general store, and she sat on the stool and they ate the pie. And she told him about the cattle trade in a way that was both detailed and clear, having clearly studied it in preparation for her trip. And he told her about the particular structural problems of wagon axles under heavy loads, and they disagreed, pleasantly and specifically, about whether the Studebaker Company's newer axle design was an improvement over the older one, and the disagreement lasted 20 minutes and ended without resolution, and without either of them minding. "Have you always been a smith?" she asked at one point. "My father was," he said. "I grew up in it. I thought I would do something else for a while when I was young. I rode west, tried cattle driving for one season, decided I was better at making things than moving them." "What made you choose Kansas?" He thought about this. "I got here," he said, "and it seemed like it needed things made." She looked at him for a moment with an expression that was quiet and thoughtful, and then she nodded, as if this answer made more sense to her than an elaborate one would have. That evening, Marvella Shook held what she called her regular Tuesday supper, which was a weekly tradition in which the boarding house dining room became the closest thing Caldwell Creek had to a restaurant for the evening, with townspeople paying a small sum for a meal and the chance to sit together. It was the kind of small-town institution that annoyed some people and sustained others, and Jasper had attended it irregularly over the years, sometimes for the company and sometimes simply because Marvella's Tuesday lamb stew was better than anything he could produce in his own kitchen. Augusta came down to the supper in a different dress, a deep blue one that fit her properly, and she had put her hair back up, and Jasper noticed these things from across the dining room in a way that was not entirely casual. She sat down at the long table between him and a rancher named Pete Dillard, who had a wide red face and a habit of talking about cattle prices whether or not the person he was talking to was interested. And Augusta managed Dillard with such skilled and gracious efficiency, asking him precisely the right questions to redirect his enthusiasm, that Jasper had to look away to avoid laughing. She caught him not laughing, and her eyes showed a spark of private amusement that she kept off the rest of her face, and that small shared moment of contained laughter over Pete Dillard's cattle prices felt, to Jasper, entirely disproportionately significant. After supper, several of the townspeople stayed at the table to talk, the way people do in small towns when the evenings are long and the entertainment is sparse. Marvella had a fiddle player, a 15-year-old boy named Tommy Greer who played with more enthusiasm than skill, but enthusiasm covers a lot of ground, and people pushed back from the table, and the talking got louder and warmer with the comfort of full bellies and familiar company. Augusta sat beside Jasper and they talked, quietly enough to be private in the noise of the room, about books. This began because she mentioned the crate of books in her wagon and he mentioned his bookshelf and she asked what was on it and he told her, and one of the titles made her eyes widen with something very close to delight. "You have read Middlemarch," she said. "3 times," he said. She stared at him for a long moment. "In Kansas," she said. "Books do not know where they are," he said. She laughed at that, a real, unguarded laugh that she seemed briefly surprised to have produced, and Jasper Fletcher, sitting beside her in Marvella Shook's dining room with Tommy Greer sawing away at a reel in the background, felt something inside him shift with the slow, deep permanence of a tectonic thing, the kind of movement you only understand in retrospect, when you look back and realize that the landscape has changed. He walked her to the foot of the boarding house stairs when the evening wound down, and they stood there for a moment in the hallway with the noise of the departing townspeople behind them, and he was very aware of how close she was standing and of the way the lamplight made amber of her dark hair. "Thank you for supper, Mr. Fletcher," she said. "Marvella should get the thanks," he said. "She will," said Augusta, "but you stayed and made it worth being at." He did not know what to say to that. He looked at her and she looked at him, and there was something in the air between them that was neither uncomfortable nor resolved, just present, like the low charge before weather. "Good night," she said, and went up the stairs, and he stood at the bottom of them for a moment after she had gone, hat in hand, feeling the specific absurdity of a man of 27 standing in a boarding house hallway feeling like something significant had just happened in the most ordinary possible way. He went home. He did not sleep particularly well. The next day, Wednesday, he finished the axle by mid-morning. It was good work. He knew it as soon as he quenched it and looked at it in the full morning light, clean and strong and true. He fitted the spare wheel he had on the wall, dressed and trued it, checked the spokes, replaced 2 that were not to his satisfaction. He went out to the wagon in the mid-morning heat and began the work of reassembling, getting the wagon off the ditch stones he had used to prop it and fitting the new axle and wheel with the careful precision that was both his skill and his character. Augusta appeared at noon and looked at the work he had done on the wagon with the same attentive assessment she applied to everything. "You do good work," she said. "Yes," he said, because he did, and it did not seem useful to argue with the truth. She crouched down and looked at the new axle up close, running her finger along the line where the steel joined the iron collar, and the gesture was so familiar, so similar to the way she had knelt in the mud of the ditch in the hailstorm to assess the broken one, that he felt a pang of something he recognized as a reluctance to see her go. She stood up and dusted her hands on her skirt. "I need to ask you something," she said. "All right," he said. "The road to Abilene," she said. "I have a map, but the map is 6 years old and the man at the post office tells me there have been some changes to the route near Dry Creek because of flooding last spring. Do you know it?" "I have been to Abilene twice," he said. "I know the route." Would you be willing to draw me a corrected map? He looked at her. The sun was high and hot and behind her, and she was squinting slightly against it, which made her expression harder to read. I can do better than that, he said, before he had fully decided to say it. I have business in Abilene that I have been putting off. I need to see a steel supplier about a standing order that has been wrong for 3 months. I have been writing letters and getting nowhere. He paused. I could ride with you. She was quiet for a moment. He watched her think about it, watched her weigh it the way she weighed everything, quickly and without drama. That would be an imposition, she said. I would not have offered if it were, he said. She looked at him steadily. Mr. Fletcher, she said, I want to be clear that I am capable of making the journey on my own. I know that, he said. You made it this far alone through a hailstorm. I am not offering because I doubt your capability. I am offering because the road is better with company and I have a legitimate reason to go. She held his gaze for another moment, and then something in her expression settled into a decision. The steel supplier, she said, in Abilene. Hollies and Sons on Commerce Street, he said, because this was true and because the months of wrong deliveries had been genuinely aggravating him. All right, she said. We leave at first light Thursday. He nodded. She nodded. They went back to work on the wagon. He spent Wednesday afternoon getting his affairs in order for the absence. He spoke to his neighbor, a retired cowhand named Wallace Briggs, about watching the smithy and feeding Dutch. Wallace was agreeable, being a man with time on his hands and a fondness for Dutch's indifferent company. Jasper packed a saddlebag with what he needed, checked his horse, a steady bay gelding named Cole, and then he sat in the evening quiet of his smithy and looked at the bookshelf and found himself reading nothing, just sitting, which was unlike him. The morning of Thursday was cool and pale, the sun not yet fully up when he walked Cole over to the boarding house and found Augusta already outside, her horse rehitched to the repaired wagon, her trunks loaded, the wooden box and the leather satchel stowed where she could reach them. Everything organized with the same purposeful economy that seemed to characterize her approach to any practical problem. She was wearing her riding skirt and a different shirtwaist, a pale gray one, and her hair was pinned up neatly, and she looked in the early morning light like someone who had slept well and made a plan and was ready to execute it. And Jasper Fletcher thought she was one of the most straightforwardly interesting people he had encountered in a very long time. Good morning, she said. Good morning, he said. Ready. Half a minute, she said, and went back inside and came out with 2 pieces of cornbread wrapped in cloth, one of which she handed to him without ceremony. And that was how they left Caldwell Creek, riding into the early morning on a road that was still wet from the week's rain, eating cornbread. The road to Abilene from Caldwell Creek was roughly 90 miles, a journey of 2 full days by wagon if the roads were good and 3 if they were not, with a stop overnight at the small settlement of Harper's Crossing, which had a trading post, and a decent well and occasionally offered beds if the Newsom family who ran the post had room. The morning roads were good, the recent rain having settled the dust without making the clay too soft, and they moved at a good pace, with Augusta driving the wagon and Jasper riding alongside on Cole. They talked through the morning the way they had in the smithy, easily and with real interest, filling in the spaces between them with the particular information that 2 people exchange when they are genuinely curious about each other but still slightly cautious. He learned that her father had been a schoolteacher in St. Louis, that her mother had died when Augusta was 11, that she had 2 brothers, both older, both still in Missouri, one farming and one working on the river, that she had taught herself bookkeeping from her father's accounting texts and had talked her way into her first position at 15 through sheer persistence, and a set of sample ledgers she had prepared herself to demonstrate her capability. Aldous Reeves hired you at 15, Jasper said. He was not Reeves at 15, she said. That came later. At 15, I worked for a fabric importer named Connolly, who paid me less than he paid the men doing the same work and assumed this was simply the order of things. Is that why you left? Eventually, she said. And because he had a way of calling me little girl when he disagreed with a figure I had given him that was correct, and I found that the longer I stayed the more I disliked the sound of my own name in his mouth. He was quiet for a moment. "That is a wrong way to treat someone," he said. "Yes," she said simply. "It is." They rode in companionable silence for a while. The plains opened around them, wide and golden and indifferent, the sky vast above, and in the distance the shadow line of a low ridge that Jasper knew as the edge of the creek valley they would follow south. A hawk circled above a stand of dry grass 100 yards off the road and then dropped, and that was the only drama the landscape offered for a long stretch. "What happened to your family?" Augusta asked after a while. "You said your father was a smith." "He died in 1866, Jasper said. "My mother a year before that. I have a sister, Clara. She married a man in Jefferson City. I see her when I can, which is not often enough." "Do you miss Missouri?" He thought about this with the same seriousness he gave her all her questions, which she had noticed he could tell, and which seemed to matter to her. "I miss the trees," he said finally. "Kansas is beautiful, but it is a spare beauty. Missouri has a kind of green abundance that Kansas doesn't. But I stopped missing Missouri the way a person misses home after enough time. It became the way a person misses something that was good in the past rather than something they need to go back to." She looked at him from the wagon seat, and the expression on her face was one he was beginning to recognize, a kind of careful, attentive interest that she directed at things she found genuinely worth understanding. "That is a distinction most people do not bother to make," she said. "Between missing and needing," he said. "Yes," she said. "I have had a lot of quiet evenings to think about things," he said. And there was something in the way he said it that was not self-pity, but was perhaps an honest acknowledgment of a particular kind of life, and he watched her receive it without rushing to fill the space with something comforting, which he appreciated. They reached Harper's Crossing in the early afternoon of the second day, having camped the previous night on the open plain under a sky so thick with stars that Augusta had stood outside the wagon for a long time, simply looking up at them. Jasper had built the fire and she had made the coffee, and they had sat on opposite sides of the fire with the dark plains stretching away in every direction, and talked about whether George Eliot knew more about human nature than most people who had actually lived longer. And the conversation had gone on until the fire was low coals, and the coyotes were calling from somewhere to the north. And when Augusta finally said good night and climbed into the wagon, Jasper sat for a long time alone with the coals and did not feel alone at all. The Newsom family at Harper's Crossing had room, and Jasper took a cot in the trading post's back room, and Augusta took the small bedroom that the Newsoms rented to travelers. And in the morning Mrs. Newsom gave them eggs and salted pork and strong coffee, and Jasper paid for both their breakfasts before Augusta could reach her purse, and she looked at him with a sharp, clear-eyed expression that was on the border between pleased and prepared to object. "It is not a statement about your capabilities," he said quietly. "It is simply breakfast." The expression softened. "Thank you," she said. They were in Abilene by Friday afternoon. Abilene in 1873 was a cattle town in transition. The years of the great Kishom Trail drives had made it loud and wealthy and rough, and though the drives had begun to shift south and west, the town still carried the energy of that era, the stockyards still operational, the main street still wide and well-worn, the hotels and saloons still doing the business of a town that had been built for volume. It was bigger than Caldwell Creek by several magnitudes, with brick buildings going up beside the older timber frame ones, and a genuine sense of commerce that was both exciting and abrasive after 2 days on the quiet plains. Augusta checked into the Drover's Inn, which was respectable, and Jasper took a room at a smaller establishment 2 streets over. He went to Holly's and Sons the afternoon of their arrival, and had a blunt and productive conversation with the senior Hollys about the 3 months of incorrect steel deliveries, and left with a corrected order and a credit against future billing, which was the outcome he had wanted and which he felt good about. He met Augusta for supper at the Drovers' in dining room that evening, and she had already done her first round of reconnaissance, having visited the law office of Gerald Sims's lawyer, a man named Whitmore, that afternoon. "Whitmore is frightened of his own client," she said over the soup course, "which tells me something about Sims." "What does it tell you?" Jasper said. "That Sims is the kind of man who uses the fact that he is owed favors as a reason to avoid his own obligations," she said. "Men like that are not actually formidable. They are simply practiced at making themselves difficult to reach." She paused. "Whitmore told me Sims would meet with me Monday morning if I came to his office." "He did not tell me I would find Sims at the stockyards tomorrow." Jasper looked at her. "How did you find that out?" "Mrs. Whitmore told me," she said with a slight smile. "She was in the office when I arrived, and she is considerably less frightened of Sims than her husband is, and considerably more sympathetic to the matter of an estate that has been waiting 8 months for what it is owed." He sat back in his chair and looked at her across the table. "You are remarkable," he said, and said it straight, without softener or complication, because it was the true thing. Color came into her face and she looked down at her soup for a moment, and the unself-consciousness with which she received the compliment, the slight surprise of it, the way she did not deflect or dismiss it but simply let it land, told him something about her. She was not accustomed to being called remarkable. She was accustomed to being called capable, or efficient, or clever, which were all true but which missed the essential thing. "I am practical," she said. "Yes," he said, "and remarkable." She looked up at him and the color was still in her face, and they held each other's gaze for a moment that was neither brief nor innocent, and then she picked up her soup spoon with a composure that he admired very much. Saturday morning she went to the stockyards and he went with her, not because she asked, but because she did not say he shouldn't, which he had learned to interpret as permission. The stockyards were loud and dusty, and smelled powerfully of cattle and the men who managed them. And Gerald Sims was not difficult to find once you knew he would be there. A large, florid man in a good suit that was too warm for the weather, standing at a pen railing with 2 other men who had the look of buyers. Augusta walked up to Gerald Sims with the leather satchel over her shoulder and the wooden box under her arm and said, in a perfectly clear and entirely conversational tone, "Mr. Sims, my name is Augusta Keating. I represent the estate of Aldous Reeves. I have here the complete documentation of the $3,200 owed to that estate under the terms of the promissory note you signed in March of 1872. I understand we have an appointment Monday morning, but I find I am available today as well if you are." Gerald Sims looked at her. The 2 buyers looked at her. Jasper, who was standing a few steps back, watched Sims's face go through several stages of recognition, surprise, calculation, and something that he identified as a man deciding how publicly difficult he wanted to make himself. "Miss Keating," Sims said, and the way he said it had a slight edge of condescension that Jasper felt like a splinter, "this is hardly the place." "I agree that the stockyards are not ideal," Augusta said pleasantly. "Shall we find somewhere quieter? I am entirely flexible." Sims looked from her to the 2 buyers and back. There was a calculation going on behind his eyes that had to do with appearances, and with the discomfort of having this particular conversation in front of men he wanted to impress. "Monday morning," he said, in a tone that was supposed to close the discussion. "Monday morning is perfectly fine," Augusta said, matching his tone completely. "I will be at your office at 9. I will also, if that meeting is unproductive, be speaking with the Territorial Land Office on Monday afternoon regarding the secondary property listed as collateral in the original note." She smiled with complete pleasantness. "I look forward to seeing you Monday, Mr. Sims." She turned and walked away. Jasper walked with her. He did not say anything until they were out of the stockyards and back on the main road, and then he said, "The Territorial Land Office." "The property is legitimately listed as collateral," she said. I checked the land records Thursday at the clerk's office before we left Caldwell Creek. You checked the land records before we left. I checked them by letter 3 weeks ago and confirmed with the clerk in person Thursday morning. She paused. I wanted to be certain the records had not been altered. Sims has connections to the county clerk's office. I was not going to present a document I had not verified myself. Jasper stopped walking. She stopped too half a step later and turned to look at him. Augusta, he said, and it was the first time he had used her given name and he felt her register it, a brief alertness in her expression. How long have you been working this case alone? Since October, she said. 8 months. And before this, managing the entire estate disentanglement. Yes. Does anyone know how much you have been carrying? She was quiet for a moment, and the quiet had a different quality than her usual considering pauses. It had something unguarded in it, something that was not quite used to the question being asked. My brothers knew something was happening, she said finally. They offered to come. I told them there was no need. Was there no need? There was no need for them to come, she said carefully. That is not the same as there being no weight to it. He looked at her. The Abilene Street moved around them. Cattle hands and merchants and a wagon loaded with lumber, the ordinary noise and motion of a busy town, and in the middle of all of it Augusta Keating stood with her leather satchel and her wooden box and her 8 months of solitary work. And Jasper Fletcher thought that he had never in his life wanted so much to be useful to a particular person. Let me help, he said. Whatever you need for Monday. Another set of eyes on the documents. Someone to know where you are and what the meeting is supposed to achieve. Just let me help. She looked at him for a long moment, and this time the considering pause was something he could see her walking through, not the quick professional calculation she brought to practical problems, but something slower and more interior, the question of whether to allow something. All right, she said, quietly. They spent Saturday afternoon at a table in the hotel dining room going through the documents in the leather satchel together. Jasper was not a bookkeeper and told her so, but he could follow the logic of a transaction, and he asked questions when he didn't follow the logic. And Augusta's answers were patient and precise, and occasionally illuminating in ways that had nothing to do with the documents themselves, small windows into the way her mind worked, the particular paths her thinking took, the places where her certainty was absolute, and the places where she acknowledged uncertainty with the same honest precision she brought to everything else. At one point, she spread a large sheet across the table that had a complex of notations and cross-references on it, and said, "This is the one I need him to acknowledge. Everything else flows from this. If he accepts this document, the rest is arithmetic." Jasper studied it. "And if he doesn't, then I go to the Territorial Land Office," she said, "and the arithmetic happens without his cooperation." "He will accept it," Jasper said. She looked at him. "You sound certain. You gave him a choice in front of witnesses this morning between settling this quietly on Monday and having the land office involved," he said. "A man like Sims values his reputation in the cattle community above most things. Settling quietly is the better option for him, and he knows it. He will bluster on Monday, and then he will settle." She was quiet, looking at the document. "I have thought the same thing," she said. "Then we are agreed." "We are agreed," she said, and something in her voice had a warmth that went beyond agreement, a small note of gratitude, not for the prediction but for the company in making it. Sunday in Abilene had a different quality from the working days, a slight drawing back of the town's usual energy, and Jasper and Augusta spent it at a slower pace. He took her to a bookshop he had discovered the previous time he had been in Abilene, a small place tucked between a saddle shop and a telegraph office, run by a quiet, spectacled man who had clearly decided that a cattle town was as good a place as any to sell books, and seemed genuinely pleased whenever someone came in who was there to look rather than to use the place as a shortcut between streets. Augusta moved through the shelves with a focused pleasure that was lovely to watch, pulling books out, reading first lines, sometimes reading a whole page before returning the volume to its place. She bought 2 books and stood at the counter for a long time talking with the bookseller about a third one she had read the previous year. And Jasper bought a copy of a surveying manual he had been wanting for some time and stood back and watched her talk about books with the easy confidence of someone who considered this a serious subject, which she clearly did. They ate lunch at a small place near the hotel and walked by the Smoky Hill River in the afternoon, which had a gentleness at its edges that was a relief after the noise of the main streets, the water moving brown and slow between its cottonwood banks. And they sat on the bank for a while and talked about things that had nothing to do with documents or steel orders or broken axles. Things like whether the Missouri River was better or worse than the Smoky Hill. Better, they agreed, but not by as much as a Missourian would claim, and whether the western expansion of the railroads was ultimately good for a place like Kansas. Possibly, they disagreed productively, and what they would each do with $3,000 if it fell into their hands freely. She was quiet for a moment after this question, then said, "Property, land specifically, a piece of land that is mine." She paused. "I have been living in rented rooms my entire adult life. That is practical and I do not regret it, but there is something I want about having ground that belongs to me." "Where?" he said. She looked at the river. "I am not sure yet. I have been thinking about it more seriously in the past months. Since Aldous died." He had a thing about property, about owning things, not because of greed but because he believed that security was material and that material security was a precondition for everything else. He used to say that a person cannot think freely if they are worried about where they will sleep. She turned the thought over. "I think he was right. He sounds like a man worth working for," Jasper said. "He was," she said, and the simplicity of it carried a real grief, briefly present and then settled. "He was fair, which is not a small thing, and he took me seriously from the beginning, which was even less small." Jasper looked at the water. "I think about property too," he said. "The smithy is rented. The house is rented. I have been saving for 5 years with the idea of owning them eventually, but Perkins, who owns the building, has not wanted to sell. I am beginning to think I may need to build." "In Caldwell Creek," she said. "Possibly, or somewhere that comes to need a good smith." He paused. "It is a strange thing about a trade like mine. I can go anywhere there are horses and wagons and things that need mending. The trade is portable in a way that most are not." She looked at him with the quiet, attentive expression he had been thinking about at irregular intervals for the past several days. "Is that freeing or unsettling?" she asked. "Both," he said honestly. "But more freeing than unsettling, I think, if you have a reason to stay somewhere." The silence that followed this was not empty. It had the quality of 2 people allowing something to be said without saying it directly. And the Smoky Hill River moved past them in its slow, brown way, and the cottonwood leaves stirred overhead, and a red-tailed hawk called somewhere to the south. And Jasper was aware, with a certainty that was not anxious but simply clear, that the quiet thing hanging in the air between them was the fact that he was developing a reason to stay. And that the reason had dark eyes and a firm handshake and 8 months of work, and the ability to walk out of a hailstorm and kneel in the mud and put her hands on a broken axle. He did not say any of this, but when they stood up from the riverbank to walk back to the hotel, their hands were close together, and when she slipped her hand into his on the path back through the cottonwoods, it was so natural and unhesitating that he simply closed his fingers around hers, and they walked back through the Sunday afternoon quiet of Abilene, as though this were simply the way things had always been. She did not let go until they reached the hotel steps, and when she did not say anything about it, and neither did he, but she looked up at him for a moment in the slant of the evening sun with an expression on her face that was open and sure, and entirely unlike the careful, assessing look she gave the world in general. "Good night, Jasper," she said. "Good night, Augusta," he said. Monday morning came in gray and cool, one of those early autumn Kansas mornings that smells of coming change, and they ate breakfast together in the hotel dining room at 8 and walked to Gerald Sims's office on the south end of Commerce Street at 8:45. Augusta had the leather satchel and the wooden box, and she walked with the particular stride of a woman who has done a hard thing well and knows it. Sims kept them waiting for 20 minutes, which was a small power play that Augusta observed without comment, reading one of the new books she had bought at the bookshop. Jasper sat beside her and watched the door of the inner office and thought about the axle he needed to forge for Pete Dillard back in Caldwell Creek, and tried not to think about the fact that their business here would be concluded by the end of the day, and the return journey would bring them back to Caldwell Creek by Wednesday, and then she would continue on to Abilene, except she was already in Abilene, which meant she would go where she was going next, and wherever that was away from Caldwell Creek. He was interrupted in this thought by Sims's door opening. The meeting lasted 1 hour and 40 minutes. Jasper was not a party to it, which was correct and which he understood, but he could hear the shape of it through the office door, the initial bluster he had predicted, a long period of discussion in which Augusta's voice was steady and clear, and Sims's cycled through several registers of discomfort, and then a long, quiet stretch that was either reading or thinking or both. At one point Sims raised his voice, a short, sharp note of objection, and Augusta's response was inaudible but brief, and Sims did not raise his voice again. She came out of the inner office at 10:50. Behind her, Sims stood in the doorway looking like a man who had been efficiently and politely disassembled and had no complaint that would hold water. Augusta's expression was composed. She met Jasper's eyes and gave him a small nod that meant it was done. They were outside on Commerce Street before she said anything. She stopped on the pavement and pressed both hands flat on the closed leather satchel and let out a long, slow breath, and then she tilted her face up to the gray morning sky, and Jasper watched something enormous release itself from her shoulders, some accumulated weight that had been residing there for 8 months, and the relief on her face when she looked back down at him was raw and real and completely unguarded. "He accepted the note," she said. "He is paying by draft against his Abilene account. I take it to the bank this afternoon and it is done." Jasper let out his own breath. "Augusta," he said. $3,200, she said. "Every cent. The estate is settled." He did not think about it. He simply opened his arms and she walked into them, and he held her in the middle of Commerce Street in Abilene, Kansas, with the gray October sky overhead and the sounds of the cattle town all around them, and she held him back, her face against his shoulder, and he could feel her breathe, long and steadying and finally free. She pulled back after a moment and looked up at him. Her eyes were bright. "Thank you," she said, and the word carried much more than its usual weight. "You did it," he said. "I know," she said, "but you were here." They went to the bank. They watched the draft be processed and received the receipt, and Augusta put it in the wooden box with the brass latch, and they walked out of the bank into the late morning and stood on the street in the growing warmth of a day that had decided, after all, to be clear, and Jasper said, "We should celebrate." She laughed. "Yes," she said, "we absolutely should." They had lunch at the best restaurant Abilene offered, a proper establishment with tablecloths and a menu printed on card, and they ordered things that were impractical and pleasant, and they talked with the easy, free-ranging quality of two people who have been through something together, and come out the other side and find themselves, suddenly, with the room to simply enjoy each other without any particular task pressing down. Over the coffee, Jasper put his cup down and looked at her across the tablecloth and said, directly, because he had been raised by a plain-speaking man and had never found indirection useful, "What happens when we get back to Caldwell Creek?" She looked at him. She had been waiting for this question, he could tell. She had been waiting for it with the same preparedness she brought to the meeting with Sims, not armored but ready. "What do you mean?" she said, though he suspected she knew. "I mean that you are on your way somewhere," he said, "and I am in Caldwell Creek, and I find that I care very much about the answer to the question of what you are going to do with yourself now that this is settled." She held his gaze. The restaurant moved around them in its ordinary way. "I was thinking," she said carefully, "of going to Topeka. There is a trading company there looking for a head bookkeeper. I made inquiries before I left St. Louis." "Topeka," he said. "Yes." She paused. "It is not so far from Caldwell Creek." He looked at her. Something very warm and very careful opened up in his chest. "No," he said, "it is not so far." 80 miles approximately, she said, and the precision of the number was so entirely, specifically Augusta, that he found himself smiling. "I could ride 80 miles, he said. "I imagine you could," she said. "You rode 90 to get here." "Augusta," he said. "Jasper," she said. And the way she said his name was different from the composed, professional way she said everything else, softer and more deliberate, like something she had been holding carefully and was only now setting down with intention. "I do not want to say something too quickly," he said, "and if you think I am a man who says things too quickly, so I will say the smaller version of the thing and let it stand." She waited. "I would like to see you again," he said, "after we return, in whatever way you are willing to be seen." She was quiet for a moment, her hands around her coffee cup, her eyes on his face. "I would like that," she said, "very much." They rode back to Caldwell Creek on Tuesday and Wednesday, the return journey made different by the thing that had been named between them, not dramatically different. They were still two people on a road, one on horseback and one driving a wagon, but the quality of the air between them had changed the way a landscape changes when the light shifts, the same shapes but everything more vivid and more defined. They talked differently. Or rather, the same things they talked about had a different undertone, a consciousness of the other person as not just an interesting companion, but as someone whose opinions and history and ways of thinking were now specifically precious rather than generally interesting. When she told him more about her childhood in St. Louis, about the long evenings when her father had made her, and her brother's work through mathematical problems at the kitchen table not as punishment, but as a form of the best entertainment he knew, he listened with the quality of a man storing something, filing it away with care. On the second night, camped again on the open plain, the fire smaller and more comfortable this time, the stars the same extravagant display they had been on the way out, he sat across from her and said, "Can I ask you something?" "Yes," she said. "The wooden box," he said. "You carried it the whole way, through the storm in the barn on the wagon. You never let it out of your hands if you could help it. What is in it?" She looked at him for a moment with an expression that was assessing in a way that was not professional but personal, deciding something. Then she reached beside her and lifted the box from where she had set it near her feet, and she opened the brass latch. Inside, nested in a piece of green velvet, was a watch. A good one, a gold hunter case, clearly old and clearly cared for. She lifted it out and held it for a moment without opening it. "This was Aldous Reeves's watch," she said. "His father gave it to him and his grandfather gave it to his father. When he died, there was no family. He had been married, but his wife died years ago and they had no children. The estate had no heir except the creditors." She turned the watch in her hand. "His lawyer wanted to sell it with the other personal effects. I told him I would buy it. I paid $8 for it, which was what the pawnbroker valued it at." She paused. "I am going to have it buried with him. His grave is in Topeka because that is where he died. His family is buried in Missouri and I cannot get him to Missouri, but I can see that something of his that was important goes with him." Jasper looked at the watch in her hands and then at her face in the firelight. "You have been carrying that watch from St. Louis," he said. "Yes," she said simply. He was quiet for a long moment. "You are a good person, Augusta Keating," he said. She set the watch gently back in its velvet and closed the box. "He was good to me," she said. "This is a very small thing." "No," he said, "it is not." She met his eyes across the fire, and the look between them had a warmth that was not just the fire's and a depth that had been building since the moment she stepped out of a storm-hammered wagon in a ditch 40 yards from his smithy and asked him, practically and without preamble, how far it was to the nearest smith. They arrived back in Caldwell Creek on Wednesday afternoon, the wagon rolling down the main road with the dust of the plains still on them, and the smell of the open country in their clothes. And Caldwell Creek received them with its characteristic indifference. which is to say Pete Dillard waved from in front of the general store, and Marvella Shook appeared in the doorway of the boarding house, and looked at the wagon with the satisfied expression of a woman whose room rental had extended beyond the original booking. Augusta was not staying. She had, during the ride home, been specific about this with herself and with him, not coldly but honestly. She had a position to interview for in Topeka, and a grave to visit, and the small but purposeful life she had been building that needed attending to. She would leave on Thursday. Wednesday evening Jasper asked if she would come to supper at his house, which he had never asked anyone to do, and she said yes, and he cooked, competently if without flourish, a beef stew with the potatoes and onions he had left before the trip and good bread from Marvella that he talked Marvella into selling him a loaf of. Augusta came to the house that attached to the back of the smithy and looked around it with her characteristic attentiveness, taking in the bookshelf with the 7 well-worn books, now 9, with the 2 she had given him from her crate, the clean kitchen, the single chair by the window, and Dutch the cat, who was sitting on the workbench by the kitchen window, and regarding Augusta with the same comprehensive disinterest he brought to all things. "He will not come to you," Jasper said, about Dutch. "That is all right," Augusta said, and she went and sat on the workbench beside Dutch and put her hand near him without touching, and Dutch looked at the hand with ostentatious indifference, and then, with the magnificent condescension of a cat who has decided to dispense a favor, pressed his head briefly against her knuckles before walking away. Jasper stared. "Dutch does not do that," he said. "He did," said Augusta, looking slightly pleased. They ate supper at the small table in the kitchen, and the food was good, and the evening was long, and they sat after the dishes were done and talked about everything, and nothing in the particular way of 2 people who know they are close to a parting, and are making the time expand through quality if not quantity. They talked about Topeka, and what she hoped for there. They talked about his plans for the smithy and whether Perkins might eventually sell. They talked about the 8 books on the shelf and what the 9th and 10th should be. Dutch sat on the windowsill above them and contributed nothing. Toward 10 o'clock, in the quiet after a long, easy stretch of silence, Augusta said, "I want to tell you something." "All right," he said. "I have been very careful for a long time," she said, "about what I allow to matter to me. That is not an accident. It is a decision I made early and have maintained because it has served me well." She paused, looking at her hands. "It has meant that I have done my work and managed my affairs and built something that belongs to me, and I do not regret any of that." "But," he said gently, she looked up at him. "But I rode into your town in a hailstorm with a broken axle," she said, "and you came out in the ice and calmed my horse and asked nothing except whether I wanted the wagon fixed, and every day since then I have found it somewhat less comfortable to maintain the carefulness." She paused. "I did not expect that." He looked at her. The kitchen was warm and the lamp was low and the night outside was still, and Jasper Fletcher had the clear, steady, certain feeling of a man who is exactly where he should be. "I have been quiet for a long time," he said. "By choice, mostly. I convinced myself that quiet was enough. And then you came out of that wagon and went straight to the axle, and I started noticing that the smithy sounded different when you were in it." She held his gaze. "Different how?" "Less like the inside of my own head," he said. The silence after this was full and warm, and neither of them moved for a moment. Then he said, "Augusta." "Yes," she said, and there was something in the single syllable that was both an answer to his question and a response to the thing that had not yet been asked, and he reached across the small table and took her hand, and she turned her hand over and held his, and that simple joining of hands in the quiet kitchen of a small house behind a smithy in Caldwell Creek, Kansas, was as close to a declaration as either of them needed. He walked her back to the boarding house that evening, and at the foot of the steps he said, "I will write to you." "I would like that very much," she said. "And I will come to Topeka in the spring if you will have me," he said. She looked at him with the open, warm, direct expression that he had come to understand was her most genuine face. "Come before the spring," she said. "Come in November." "November," he said. "Yes," she said. and she stood on the step above him so that their eyes were level, and she leaned forward and kissed him, softly and briefly and with complete intention, and then she stepped back and looked at him, and her expression was not uncertain in any way. "Good night, Jasper," she said. "Good night, Augusta," he said. She left Thursday morning, as she had said she would, and Jasper Fletcher stood in the road and watched her wagon move away down the Topeka road in the early morning light with the feeling of a man who has been given something extraordinary and is now holding it carefully, not in fear of losing it but in full awareness of its worth. He went back to his smithy and picked up his hammer. Dutch appeared from somewhere and sat on the stool by the door. The forge heated with its familiar roar. And Jasper thought about the axle he needed to forge for Pete Dillard, and about Topeka in November, and about the way she had said come before the spring, and the hammer rang against the iron with a sound that was still the same sound it had always been, but that resonated now in a room that felt, for the first time in several years, genuinely inhabited. He wrote to her that evening. He had not written a letter to anyone except his sister Clara in a very long time, and the first draft was formal and careful and not at all what he meant, and he threw it out. The second draft was better, direct and warm and specific, in the way that he was direct and warm and specific in conversation, and he mentioned the books, and Dutch's uncharacteristic behavior, and Pete Dillard's wagon rims, and he ended by saying that he found himself looking forward to November with a keenness he had not applied to any particular date in a long time. Her first letter arrived 2 weeks later. It was 3 pages long. She had arrived in Topeka and visited the grave, and she had laid the watch beside the headstone and said what she needed to say to Aldous Reeves in a quiet October morning in a Topeka cemetery, and then she had gone to the trading company and interviewed and been offered the position at a salary she deemed acceptable. She had found rooms on a good street near the business district, 2 rooms of her own, the first time in her adult life she had had 2 rooms rather than 1. She said the second room currently had nothing in it except her crate of books and 1 chair, and she was deciding what to do with it. Then, near the end of the letter, she wrote, "I think about Caldwell Creek more than I expected to. I think about the smithy and the sound of the hammer in the morning, and about a man who reads Middlemark by himself in Kansas and comes out in a hailstorm without being asked. I find I am not maintaining my carefulness particularly well. I am choosing to take that as a good sign." He read this letter 4 times and then put it carefully in the wooden box he kept in the kitchen where he kept his important documents, and it sat there beside his land records and his sister's letters and his father's Smith certification from 1849, in good company. He wrote back the same evening. The letters went back and forth through October and into November, each one longer and more certain than the last, building between them a correspondence that was honest and warm and full of the particular intimacy of 2 people learning each other at depth. She wrote about the trading company and the state of its accounts, which were not as orderly as they should have been, and the challenge of that, and the satisfaction of bringing order to disorder. He wrote about the smithy and the plains and the approach of winter, and about the book he was rereading and the passage in it that had made him think of her. She wrote about the city and what she noticed in it and what she missed about the open country. He wrote about Dutch, who had developed a habit of sitting precisely on whatever book Jasper was trying to read, which seemed passive-aggressive even for a cat. She wrote back, "I know you will disagree with me, but I think Dutch is trying to tell you something. Perhaps that he requires more company, or perhaps that you do." He smiled at that for a long time. November came to the Kansas plains with the particular severity of early winter on open ground, the wind coming down from the north with nothing to interrupt it, and the grass going from gold to brown to the pale, dry gray of dormancy. Jasper loaded his saddlebags on the 8th of November, left Dutch and the smithy in Wallace Briggs's capable hands, and rode north toward Topeka with Cole's breath making small clouds in the cold air, and the whole wide Kansas sky overhead, turning the particular shade of winter blue that was like an announcement. He arrived in Topeka on the afternoon of the 9th, stiff from the cold and trail dusty, and he tied Cole at the livery on the main street and asked a boy where Bancroft Street was, which was the street she had given him in the letter, and he walked to number 14 and knocked on the door. She opened it. She was in a wool skirt and a dark red shirtwaist that was the color of late autumn leaves, and she had ink on her right forefinger from what was clearly an afternoon of accounting, and she stood in her doorway and looked at him, and the expression on her face was one he would remember for the rest of his life. "You came," she said. "November," he said. She laughed and stepped back and let him in. The 2 rooms were not empty. They were hers, thoroughly and specifically, the books unpacked and shelved, a good desk by the window in the second room that was now clearly the working room, a kitchen that was organized in a way that reflected her exact and orderly mind, and a sitting area with 2 good chairs by a small stove. The second room still had only 1 chair, but the books made it feel full. He brought her apples from an orchard near Caldwell Creek, which had been recommended to him by Mrs. Crowley as the best in the county, wrapped in cloth and packed carefully in his saddlebag. She received them with a delight that was entirely out of proportion to their scale, and immediately cut 2 of them and made him sit down while she put coffee on. And the normality of this, the simple, warm ordinariness of sitting in her kitchen while she made coffee and cut apples, was the most contented Jasper Fletcher had felt in his own memory. He stayed in Topeka for 4 days. They walked the city. They sat in her rooms and read and talked, and were quiet together in the specific, comfortable way that is different from simply being quiet in proximity, the way that requires a genuine ease with another person's presence. They went to dinner at a restaurant on the second evening, and he met 2 of her colleagues from the trading company, a man named Henry Marsh, who was pleasant and direct, and a woman named Ruth Callow, who was sharp and funny, and who looked at Jasper with the particular assessing interest of a person who knows something important about the person beside him, and is trying to determine if Jasper deserves it, and who seemed, by the end of the evening, to have reached a favorable conclusion. On the 3rd evening, after dinner, walking back through the Topeka streets in the cold night air, he took her hand the way she had taken his on the Smoky Hill riverside, naturally and without ceremony, and she leaned her shoulder briefly against his as they walked, and they talked about the most ordinary things in the most contented tones, and when they reached her door and stood in the lamplit entry of number 14 Bancroft Street, Jasper said what he had been carrying for weeks with the same plain directness that was his most natural mode. "I am in love with you," he said. "I want you to know that, not as a pressure and not as a demand, just as a fact that you should have." She looked up at him in the lamp light with her dark eyes and her strong jaw and the ink still faintly on her right forefinger. "I know," she said. "I am in love with you too. I have been since about the apple pie on the second day." He stared at her. "The apple pie. You disagreed with me about the Studebaker axle design with complete sincerity and no attempt to defer because you thought you should," she said. "And then you went and bought apple pie, and that was the specific combination that did it." He thought about this for a moment. "I will never argue with your methodology," he said. "No," she said, "do not start doing that now." He kissed her properly then, in the way that a man kisses a woman he loves, which is to say with complete attention and full acknowledgement of the specific person in front of him, and she kissed him back with the same straightforward certainty she brought to everything. The 4th day of his visit, the day he was supposed to leave, neither of them mentioned leaving until the afternoon, and when he finally said he needed to get coal and start back before the cold deepened, they stood in her sitting room and held the moment before the goodbye with the awareness of people who know that goodbyes are temporary. "I will come at Christmas," he said. "Yes," she said. "After Christmas," he said more slowly, "I want to talk about something." She looked at him. "About something specific. About whether Topeka is where you want to be," he said, "and whether Caldwell Creek is where I want to be, and whether there is a version of the future in which those 2 questions have the same answer." She held his gaze for a long, clear moment. "I have been thinking about that," she said. "Good," he said. "Think about it more and I will think about it too, and we will talk at Christmas." "All right," she said. "Jasper, yes." "Think carefully," she said. And the way she said it was not a caution but an instruction from someone who cared about the quality of his thinking, and he loved her for it with a specific and particular love. He rode south with the cold at his back and Cole's steady hoofbeats under him and the flat Kansas sky above him, and he thought carefully, as instructed, for the entire 90 miles. Christmas came to Caldwell Creek with snow that year, a real snow, unusual for the region, that blanketed the main road and the roofs and the empty plains in white, and made the world quiet and beautiful and slightly surreal. Jasper rode to Topeka 2 days before Christmas, and this time the trip had a different quality, not the urgency of the first November visit but the warmth of return, of a journey to somewhere that had become known and valued. Augusta had decorated her room simply and well with pine boughs from a market stall and 2 candles on the windowsill, and she had cooked a Christmas dinner that was genuinely excellent, roasted chicken and sweet potatoes, and a pie that she admitted was partly Marvella Shook's recipe, having written to Marvella for it in October, because the Topeka boarding house woman's pie had not been up to the standard of her memory. "You wrote to Marvella for a pie recipe," he said. "I was very polite about it," Augusta said. They had Christmas dinner together and talked about everything they had been saying in the letters, the way you repeat in person what you have already said in writing, but with the addition of expression and tone and the ability to see someone's face. And then, after the dinner and the dishes and the second cup of coffee, they sat in the 2 chairs by the small stove and Jasper said, "I have been thinking." "I know," she said. "Tell me." "I do not think Caldwell Creek is necessarily where I need to be," he said. "I have been renting there for 5 years and Perkins has no intention of selling, and the town is not growing significantly. I have been thinking about this correctly now, which means I have been thinking about where to be based on what I want the next years to look like rather than simply on inertia." She was very still, listening. "Topeka is a city," he said, "and a city of this size always needs a good smith. There is room to build something here that is mine and not rented." He paused. "I would like to come to Topeka, if that is where you are." She looked at him for a long moment. "You would leave Caldwell Creek." "I would leave a rented smithy and a rented house and Wallace Briggs's goodwill," he said, "which is real and I value it. But it is not a life I built so much as a life I settled into, and I have been asking myself since September whether settling into something is the same as choosing it." "And," she said, "I am choosing this," he said clearly, meaning her, meaning Topeka, meaning the future that was currently assembling itself in the warmth of 2 chairs by a small stove in a Kansas city. "If you will have me," she reached over and took his hand. "I will have you," she said, with full and considered sincerity. He looked at her. "Augusta Keating," he said, "will you marry me?" She was quiet for half a breath, which was the fastest he had ever seen her not answer something, and then she said, "Yes." Without condition, without qualification, just yes, full and clear and warm as the stove between them. He had a ring in his coat pocket, a simple gold band with a single small garnet that he had ordered from a jeweler in Abilene on the Monday of their visit, between the Sims meeting and the bank, because he had known then, or had been willing to allow himself to know, what was happening and what he wanted. He put it on her finger and she looked at it with an expression that had nothing of the businesswoman in it and everything of Augusta, every layer of her, the practical and the careful and the warm and the entirely particular. "November 1st to December 24th is a very short courtship," she said. "The hailstorm was September 4th, he pointed out. "The hailstorm was a broken axle," she said. "And after that," he said. She looked at him with the open, warm, certain expression he loved most. "After that," she said, "it was absolutely everything." He stayed through New Year's, and they spent the week between Christmas and the year's turning making plans of the specific, practical kind that was native to both of them. He would return to Caldwell Creek in January, settle his affairs there, end the lease, find a buyer for the equipment he could not take, arrange the journey of the things he could, and arrive in Topeka by February. He knew a man in Topeka, a smith named Cal Reuter who had been looking to expand his operation, and a letter he sent from Topeka in the last days of December received a prompt reply that Cal Reuter was very interested in discussing a partnership with a man of Jasper Fletcher's reputation. They were married in Topeka on the 14th of March, 1874, in the small church on 6th Street, with Ruth Callow as Augusta's witness and Cal Reuter as Jasper's. And Marvella shook present because she had somehow heard about the wedding and had ridden up from Caldwell Creek on her nephew's wagon, and arrived the morning of the ceremony with a pie and an absolutely unrepentant expression. And Augusta had embraced her with such genuine warmth that Marvella had looked, briefly, as if she might cry, and had resolved this by criticizing the flower arrangements. Jasper's sister Clara came from Jefferson City, having received his letter in February with a very clearly expressed request that she make the trip, and Clara Fletcher, who was 24 and sensible and who had always known her brother was someone worth knowing if a person could get past the quiet, took one look at Augusta Keating Fletcher and said, "Thank God," at a volume that was audible to several other people, and Augusta had laughed her real, unguarded laugh and said, "I quite agree." They moved into a proper house on the east side of Topeka, 3 rooms and a kitchen garden and a small barn for Cole and the roan mare, whose name, they discovered once Augusta's vocabulary for the animal had settled, was appropriately called Bess. Jasper's partnership with Cal Reuter produced, within the first year, the most productive smithy on the south end of the city, the kind of operation that grew by reputation, and Jasper found that he had been right, that a city the size of Topeka had a great deal of need for a good smith, and the work suited him in the way that good work suits a person who has always understood their own skill. Augusta's position at the trading company flourished with her full attention behind it, and within 18 months she had been given the full title of head bookkeeper, and a significant increase in salary, and the ledgers of Morrison and Bell Trading Company had been transformed from their original state of respectable disorder into something that the senior Morrison told his associates was the cleanest set of accounts he had seen in 30 years of business. The wooden box with the brass latch sat on the shelf in their bedroom. It no longer held the watch, which lay in the Topeka soil near a gray headstone on a quiet October morning. It held now the receipt from the Sims settlement, and the first letter he had written to her, and the first letter she had written to him, and the dried head of a prairie aster he had picked from the roadside on the ride into Topeka in November, and given to her when she opened the door, which she had pressed between 2 book pages without making any particular comment, which had been enough. In the spring of 1875, Augusta told him she was expecting a child, and she told him in the kitchen of the East Topeka house on a Tuesday morning in April in the same clear, direct way she told him everything, sitting across from him at the kitchen table with the morning sun coming through the window and her coffee cup in front of her. He sat quietly for a moment, and then he said, "Are you well?" "Very," she said. "And pleased?" "Very," she said again, with the warmth she had stopped keeping out of her face around him. He stood up from the table and went around it, and she turned in her chair, and he crouched down beside her and took both her hands and looked at her, and what was on his face needed no translation. "Jasper," she said softly. "I know," he said. "I know." Their son was born in October of 1875, a boy they named Thomas Aldous Fletcher. Thomas for no particular reason except that it was a strong, plain name that they both liked, and Aldous for a man who had paid Augusta Keating fairly and taken her seriously when she was 15 years old, and had left a watch that now lay in good company. Thomas arrived with a pair of lungs that suggested a significant future in some field requiring projection, and black hair that was Augusta's, and green eyes that were Jasper's, and an expression, in the very first hours of his life, of concentrated and specific alertness that made both his parents look at each other over his head with a recognition that was partly terrifying and mostly delightful. Clara came from Jefferson City for 2 weeks after Thomas arrived, and she and Augusta sat in the kitchen in the evenings after the baby was settled and talked with the ease of two women who have decided to be friends in the specific, committed way. And Jasper would sometimes come into the kitchen and find them at the table with the lamp burning, and some deep and specific conversation in progress that paused briefly for his entry and resumed without him, which he found entirely excellent. Marvella Shook sent a package from Caldwell Creek with a blanket she had made and a jar of her good jam and a note that said, in its entirety, "I expected nothing less. Give him good values." Augusta kept the note. Bess the roan mare had a foal in the summer of 1876, a sturdy little bay that Thomas, who was by then able to toddle at speed toward anything that interested him, fell immediately and completely in love with, requiring Jasper to spend a significant amount of time standing in the barn with his son on his hip, preventing the toddler from crawling directly under the foal's hooves. "He has no fear," Jasper said to Augusta one evening after the third such barn rescue of the day. "I wonder where he gets that," she said, not looking up from her ledger. He thought about this. "His mother walked out of a hailstorm and knelt in the mud to assess a broken axle," he said. She looked up then. "And his father came out in the ice without being asked," she said. He sat down at the kitchen table across from her and looked at her in the lamplight, Thomas asleep in the back room and the summer evening warm and thick and quiet outside the windows. And he thought about a September afternoon and ice coming down from a bruised sky and a crack that cut through the roar of the storm, and the woman who had walked out of the canvas at the back of the wagon with all of her purpose and all of her capability, and none of the helplessness the situation might have warranted. "Augusta," he said. She set down her pen. "Jasper, are you happy?" He asked, because it was a question worth asking aloud regularly, because happiness was something you could mistake for the background noise of a good life and forget to confirm. She looked at him across the table, at the lamp between them and the ledger and the two coffee cups and the sound of their sleeping son in the back room and the sound of the horses in the small barn and the sound of a Topeka evening going its ordinary way outside the window. "Deeply," she said. "Specifically. Without reservation." She paused. "Are you? More than I knew was possible from inside the previous version of my life," he said. She smiled, and it was the full, unguarded smile he loved most, the one she had first produced in Marvella Shook's dining room over Pete Dillard's cattle prices. And she picked up her pen, and he picked up his coffee cup, and the evening moved around them in its warm and ordinary way. In September of 1876, exactly 3 years after the hailstorm, Jasper Fletcher came home from the smithy in the late afternoon to find Augusta in the kitchen garden, weeding between the bean rows with Thomas sitting beside her in the dirt, very seriously doing what appeared to be his own weeding, which was indistinguishable from his simply pulling at whatever was nearest. The evening light was golden and long, and the sky had that late summer extravagance of depth and color that was one of the things about Kansas that was genuinely and unarguably beautiful. He stood at the garden gate and watched them, his wife and his son in the dirt in the golden light, and felt the specific, grounded, certain happiness of a man who knows exactly where he is and exactly why he is there and would not be anywhere else. She looked up and saw him at the gate. "You are standing there looking smug," she said. "I am standing here feeling grateful," he said. She looked at him for a moment with those dark eyes. Then she said, "Come and help. Thomas has been pulling up the beans." He came through the gate and crouched down in the dirt beside them, and Thomas immediately transferred his enthusiastic destruction to the patch nearest Jasper, and Augusta said, "The beans, Thomas, not the onions," and Thomas showed no sign of modifying his approach, and the evening birds called from the cottonwoods on the street and the light went gold to amber to the soft gray of coming dusk. "Jasper," she said after a while in a different tone. "Yes," he said, looking up. She was looking at him with an expression that had the same quality as that April morning the year before, the morning she had told him about Thomas. He went still. "The second time," she said, I am told, is somewhat easier. He sat back on his heels in the garden dirt and looked at his wife, and she was watching him with the particular expression of a person sharing something enormous in a very small and ordinary moment. And Thomas was still pulling at the onion tops, and the light was going, and Jasper Fletcher felt the future opening ahead of him like the Kansas plains after a long rain, clean and wide and full of growing things. "Augusta," he said. "I know," she said. When he said, "Spring," she said, "April, the doctor thinks." He reached over Thomas, who objected briefly, and took her hand the way he had taken it on the path beside the Smoky Hill River 3 years ago, in the natural, unhesitating way of something that had always been true. And she held his hand in the garden dirt with the evening settling around them and the first stars beginning to appear in the eastern edge of the Kansas sky. Their daughter was born in April of 1877, as promised, a girl with Jasper's green eyes and Augusta's jaw, and a disposition that Clara, who came again from Jefferson City, described as the most deliberate newborn she had ever encountered, by which she meant the child appeared to be observing everything with the focused interest of someone taking notes. They named her Clara Ruth Fletcher, Clara for his sister and Ruth for Augusta's friend and colleague who had stood witness at their wedding, and who, upon being told, said with characteristic bluntness that she was honored and that the child had better have good sense. Thomas, who was 18 months old and had been the center of everything since his arrival, received his sister with a brief period of uncertainty followed by a decision, apparently made one morning while Jasper was watching, to simply include her in his operations, which at that stage primarily involved the foal and the dirt in the kitchen garden, and a set of wooden blocks that Jasper had made him in the smithy. He presented Clara Ruth with a wooden block on the second day, setting it solemnly on the blanket beside her face, and Jasper counted this as one of the finest moments of his fatherhood. The smithy grew. The partnership with Cal Reuter developed and solidified into something that had the permanence of a genuine business, with 2 apprentices and a reputation that stretched across Shawnee County. Jasper designed a new type of wheel fitting in 1878 that solved a problem he had been thinking about since the day he looked at Augusta's broken axle in the light of his smithy door, a fitting that distributed the load across the axle collar more evenly, reducing the specific weakness that caused the kind of split he had repaired that September day. The fitting was adopted by 3 wagon makers in Topeka within a year and eventually, through the kind of quiet, undramatic diffusion that Good Solutions experience, by half a dozen others across the region. He never made a great noise about it. That was not his way. He simply drew it out, the way he always drew things out first when he had a problem to solve, and then he made it and it worked. Augusta, in 1879, left Morrison and Bell Trading Company to open her own bookkeeping practice, which she had been considering for 2 years and planning for 1, and which she announced to Jasper on a Thursday evening over supper with the matter-of-fact certainty of someone who has already done all the calculation and found the answer sound. The practice, A. Fletcher and Associates, opened its doors in January of 1880 and had 3 clients in the first week and 12 by the end of the first month, because a good bookkeeper in a growing city is never without need, and because Augusta Keating Fletcher was not simply a good bookkeeper but an exceptional one, and exceptional things in small communities travel by word of mouth with the speed of fire in dry grass. By 1882, she had 6 associates and offices on Commerce Street, 2 streets from where she had sat in Gerald Sims's waiting room 9 years before with a leather satchel and a wooden box and $3,200 worth of righteous determination. And the irony of this geography was not lost on her, and she had mentioned it to Jasper on the day the lease was signed with exactly the dry, private amusement that he had first seen in her face over Pete Dillard's cattle prices in Marvella Shook's dining room. Thomas started at the Topeka School in 1881, having been read to since before he could talk, and having taught himself to recognize most of the letters in Augusta's bookshelf, by the age of 3, by sheer dint of attention and proximity. And his teachers said he was focused and curious and sometimes corrected other students' arithmetic, which was both impressive and periodically unpopular. Clara Ruth turned out to be a child of strong opinions and considerable charm, which she deployed with strategic efficiency from approximately the age of 4, and which Jasper felt was entirely and clearly Augusta's doing, and which Augusta attributed to heredity with a look of serene innocence. In the fall of 1883, 10 years after the hailstorm, they drove out of Topeka on a Sunday afternoon in October, the whole family, Jasper and Augusta on the wagon seat and Thomas and Clara Ruth in the bed, and they drove south on the road toward Caldwell Creek, not the whole way but far enough to be out of the city and on the open plains, and they stopped on the long flat stretch where the road ran between the creek and the ridge. With the sky enormous overhead, and the grass gone to its winter gold, and the distance uninterrupted in every direction. Thomas, who was 8, climbed out of the wagon bed and stood looking at the plains with the attentive, cataloging expression that was so thoroughly his mother's that Jasper sometimes had the disorienting experience of looking at the future and the past simultaneously. "It is very big," Thomas said, meaning the sky, the plains, all of it. "Yes," Jasper said. "Why did you stay here?" Thomas said, meaning Kansas, meaning the West, "when you could have gone back east." Jasper looked at his son, and then he looked at Augusta, who was sitting beside him on the wagon seat with Clara Ruth on her lap in the October wind moving the loose strands of her hair, and she was looking at him with a slight smile and an expression that said clearly, "This one is yours." "I got here," he said to Thomas, "and it needed things made." He paused. "And then someone came who needed something fixed, and I fixed it, and she fixed everything else." Thomas considered this with the gravity of 8 years old. "What did she fix?" "Everything else," Jasper said simply. Augusta made a sound beside him that was not quite a laugh but was its cousin, and she leaned her shoulder against his the way she had on the path beside the Smoky Hill River, and Clara Ruth reached up and pulled at the brim of Jasper's hat with 4-year-old insistence, and the plains went out in every direction under the October sky in all their spare and tremendous beauty, and the wagon stood on the road between the creek and the ridge, and everything was whole. He put his arm around Augusta's shoulders and she leaned into him, and the wind came across the grass with the smell of autumn on it, dry and clean and wide, and Dutch the cat, who had made the journey south in a covered basket in the wagon bed, and had communicated his displeasure about this arrangement for 90 minutes, had finally gone quiet and was presumably asleep, indifferent as ever to everything that was not his own considerable comfort. They drove home in the last of the afternoon light with the children talking and the plains going quiet around them, and Jasper Fletcher held the reins with one hand and kept his arm around his wife with the other, and felt, in the deep and settled and unhurried way that was native to him, the complete and specific and lasting satisfaction of a man whose life has turned out to be larger and warmer and more full of love than the quiet years in the smithy had prepared him to expect, and who knows it, and who counts it every day. He had come out of the smithy in a hailstorm without being asked. She had walked out of the wagon in that same storm with all of her purpose and none of her helplessness. He had fixed the wheel. She had fixed everything else, and the plains were gold and the sky was wide and they were home.